Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Center for New Liberalism. If you'd like to support us, you can do so in two ways. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. That's cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Members get a bunch of benefits like access to exclusive podcast episodes, access to our community Slack, and the ability to join their local chapters. Become a member today, support the Center for New Liberalism, and support the podcast. And thanks for listening. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Sarah Paden. Sarah is the Vice President and National Political Director at PPI, one of my colleagues, and she has an extensive experience working in democratic politics, democratic campaigns, democratic messaging. She's done a lot in New York State. It's not the only place she's operated, but she has a lot of experience here, and today she's joining us to break down exactly what has happened in the midterm elections. Tuesday night was the midterm elections. We're recording this about 11 a.m. on Wednesday morning, so we're trying to get a flash reaction. What has happened? Why did it happen? And where do we go from here? So, Sarah Paden, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's fantastic to have you. So I'm going to give just like a quick recap of kind of where we are factually right now. It seems like the two big things most people were looking at were the House and the Senate in this midterm election. There's obviously a lot of other stuff going on, but with regards to the House and the Senate, the Republicans are likely to take the House, but it seems like it's going to be more of kind of a red puddle splash or a red trickle rather than a red wave. They're likely to have a very narrow control of the House of Representatives. And with regards to the Senate, the Democrats seem to be favored to keep the Senate. We are still waiting on races in Georgia, which is probably going to go to a runoff. We're still waiting on Arizona, which looks good for Mark Kelly, a Democrat. We're still waiting on Nevada, which seems very close. But overall, the narrative that's kind of emerging here is that Democrats did better than expected. So let's start off this conversation by just, what's your flash reaction here? When you woke up this morning, what do you think is kind of your very first takeaway?
Sure. I mean, I think the first takeaway was we had a better night than we had expected, which is, pleasant for everyone. We all know that midterms tend to be sort of political mood rings, and the opposition party tends to usually have a good night in midterms. But I think the other takeaway is it was a big night for women and it was a big night for moderates.
What do you mean by a big night for moderates? Why do you think that?
Sure. I mean, I think it was either Politico or Cook a few months ago had a article that said, don't call them moderates, call them governors. And I think we could start there, right? So it was a really great night for DGA. And if you look at governors first and foremost, so many of them came back really and truly. There were no major casualties. I mean, we just saw Laura Kelly's race get called, which is just incredible in Kansas. So I think you saw their approval ratings really help them weather the drag of the president's numbers. I think we were all really worried about Wisconsin. Tony Evers came back. I think our big kind of, exception of the night is Nevada, but all in all, what a great night. We picked up Maryland. We picked up Massachusetts.
I was going to say two of the most popular governors in the country have been kind of these moderate-ish Republicans from very blue states. But now they've kind of either term limited out or decided not to run. And now we have those. Now we have Massachusetts. Now we have Maryland. And I think the first openly lesbian governor in U.S. history, right, in Massachusetts?
Yeah. Healy is.
So now we have Polis in Colorado, and in Massachusetts we've got, more gay governors, and It seems it's positive. I don't know. This is like cheerful for me. I was not expecting to be so cheerful.
You've also got Tina Kotek out in Oregon. So that's, one to not be missed. Again, if you're talking about a big night for governors and for women, I think some of the seats that we really were concerned about, we were concerned obviously about Sisolak, but we were also concerned about Wisconsin and, some of the other seats that we took in 2018. You got to remember we took a number of these seats in 2018, Michigan, New Mexico. But we, all of those governors came back and they didn't just come back. They had a big night, in my opinion. So yeah, I think that first you can look at the governors and see that was really important. And I do think we can talk a little bit about this later, but how the Dobbs decision really plays into that is significant. And then I think you can look at races like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, and even more races like Golden in Maine, and see that these were tough races. I mean, Spanberger definitely had us on the edge of our seats for a little while, but these are races that they cleared. Golden in Maine, that's a seat that Trump won, actually. So I think there is a great story to tell with the new Democratic coalition. A number of the frontline members were their members. They had really highly competitive seats. And so 14 of them are already back. Sean Casten in Illinois, I know you guys know them well. Spanberger, who I mentioned, Wexton, Mikey Sherrill, Josh Gottheimer, Pappas, Custer, Craig. I mean, you can just go through the list, and it's a really exciting list. And then you also had New Dem candidates do really well. And these were red to blue pickups, whether you're looking at Greg Landsman in Ohio or Hillary Schulten in Michigan, right? Again, Michigan had a really amazing night. You just had a lot of success stories here for moderates, I would say, up and down the ticket, and especially in the House.
One of the things you mentioned was obviously it's a big night for women, and abortion is obviously an issue that affects both genders, but women are at the forefront of that fight for obvious reasons. And abortion access and abortion rights had a big night. I believe there were 3 states where abortion was on the ballot in some form or another, either to enshrine protections or to take away rights. And I believe in every state that had an abortion question on the ballot, 3 out of 3 voted to either protect or expand abortion access, reproductive rights. Do you think that this is basically just, the shadow of Dobbs hanging over some of these states?
For sure. And I think that is, part of it. If you look at a lot of the exit polls, right? So you saw inflation was the number one issue on voters' minds, but abortion was right there after it yesterday. And I think you saw a lot of young people come out. You saw a lot of women come out. I think that's really the story of the night was abortion and a rejection of the extreme right. I would say, things that were really good for abortion was even like if you looked at the no right to abortion constitutional amendment and it was Amendment 2 in Kentucky. In Kentucky, it was overwhelmingly a no for that amendment. And I just think that's amazing. Kentucky is, historically it's a pretty Catholic state. It's a sort of a mixed bag when you're talking about Democrat and conservative. So abortion really was the story of the night across the country in a really big way. And I think especially with state legislatures, I think what you saw in Michigan and what you saw in Minnesota with the Democrats taking the state Senate was really big. I think with Michigan, right, coming out of redistricting, there was actually a shot for them to take the legislature for the first time in a long time. And they looks like they've got the House and the Senate is coming along. But I do think that also speaks to Whitmer and her power and what a rising star she really is for the Democratic Party moving forward. But yeah, I think you also saw women really have a good night. Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, Laura Kelly down in Kansas. Abortion was a big part of that. Too, as well as her very high approval rating going into the night. I think you saw this kind of across the board that women had a really good night. I mean, even Sarah Huckabee Sanders, whatever you want to say about Arkansas, whatnot, she, that's a historic, when we're talking about historics, right? Laura Healy, historic, Tina Kotek, historic, Wes Moore in Maryland, historic, and even Huckabee Sanders down in Arkansas. She will be the first female governor of Arkansas, even though she's Republican.
I do want to throw a negative shout out to the who is it, Betsy Johnson in Oregon, who nearly who nearly derailed Tina Kotek's campaign as a spoiler candidate. So thanks for that, Betsy. But hopefully, very glad it didn't work. But yeah, no,
Spoilers weren't all bad in the night, though. I mean, I think that we could potentially thank the spoiler in the Georgia Senate race for that runoff. So
yeah, well, I mean, Warnock's actually leading outright at this point. It's still going to go to a runoff, but Warnock has the lead over Walker at this point. Who knows where most of those libertarian votes, the 2% that went libertarian in Georgia, who knows where that would have gone. So here's a stat that I've been following, and I think it speaks to this whole, some of the themes we're talking about, because the standard expectation here is that if you're in power, you get just wiped out in the midterms. This is usually what happens, especially when you have both the presidency and both houses of Congress. And there's like an independent voter backlash when this happens. In 2006, George Bush, very unpopular president, Democrats won independents by 18 points. In Obama's two midterms in 2010, 2014, Republicans won the independents during the midterms by 18 points the first time and then 12 points the second time. When Trump had his midterm, 2018, Democrats win independents by 13 points. And so you'd expect coming into this, Joe Biden is president, he's not super popular, inflation is very high. You would expect that independents would go hard for Republicans. But what we're seeing is actually that independents were +2 for Democrats, basically fought to a draw. And to me, there's only a few things that can be happening there. Why are independents not crashing towards Republicans? It's got to be a little bit of Dobbs, a little bit of just frightening GOP election denial stuff. I'm curious, do you think there's anything more to it than kind of the big obvious factors?
Sure. I think there's a couple things we can look out. First and foremost, the sort of anti-Trump wall that we had as Democrats in 2020 seemed to hold. It was intact last night, by and large. We'll see again. It's still early. We're still seeing what's going to come out of Arizona in terms of that governor's race. But Pennsylvania, Shapiro and Fetterman, right? Michigan, it's a big night there. Georgia, again, like you said, Warnock, at least right now, is leading. We didn't see it with Kemp, but in a way, you can also make the argument with Kemp, right? He was, in many senses, anti-Trump when it came to that recount and everything that shook out there. And then, of course, Arizona.
He bothered to stand up to Trump, which,
exactly.
He's very, very conservative. I'm not a fan of Kemp at all, but he did give Trump the middle finger in a sense. So
absolutely. And his Secretary of State, just looking at that entire Georgia ballot.
Yeah. And you know what the craziest thing is? The whole thing, people thought Brad Raffensperger is his name, the Secretary of State who really stood up to Trump, told Trump, I'm not going to cheat for you. And people thought oh, what a brave thing. He's sacrificing his political career. He's going to end up with the highest margin of victory of any statewide race in Georgia. Yeah. I mean, again, I think that when you're talking about some of the things that happened last night, I think one of the more surprising ones, to your point of, in a year where you see low presidential approval and you see something like inflation or the economy on the ballot, we were all bracing for a much worse night than what we saw. And that's where I think abortion is the big story. But I do also think that we saw this wall, this rejection of extremism that was part of that anti-Trump movement in 2020 in all four of those states. And I think that that's something that is important for Democrats to keep in mind. I think another thing I think that Democrats did a little bit of playing with fire in the Republican primaries by really trying to elevate and also define extreme right candidates in certain states. You saw this with Dan Cox and the Westmore race in Maryland. You saw this in New Hampshire. You saw this other places, right? It was not just Democratic governors, but just Democrats in general. And really and truly, all of those people lost last night, which is kind of amazing. Because when you're looking at a Mastriano, we were all sort of, holding our breath when that first happened and shook out that way in that Republican primary, because really and truly to have somebody like that elected to office in the state of Pennsylvania would have been disaster. But it was a bet that paid off. And it was a bet that, people who were going to be turning out for the midterms and also just voters in general don't want this sort of extreme anti-democracy wing of the Republican Party that has emerged post the insurrection of 2021.
And I think abortion also helped paint that picture of extremism even more.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, as long as we're talking about like what's going on in the Republican Party, we have to talk about Trump and we have to talk about DeSantis as well, because I think one of the big things that's going to come out from this when we talk about like voters rejecting extremism, voters, being kind of afraid of the Republican Party. I don't want to delude myself into thinking that, voters are buying everything Democrats are selling. I think that voters are rightfully kind of concerned about crime and inflation and things like that. And they have concerns with some of the Democrats' policies. But I think they're also really distrustful and they really dislike the way that the GOP has run as well. And that is not going away right now. And you see a lot of like backbiting right now. Like it's already started, some backstabbing of Donald Trump, who, by the way, Donald Trump is probably going to be announcing his presidential run either today or like in the next few days. That's been widely reported. But it doesn't seem very powerful now. If he had done this off the back of a red wave, Donald Trump probably is the candidate in 2024 for president. But now there's a lot of people who are coming out and like openly wondering, should we be like dumping Trump? And I think part of that has to do with Ron DeSantis in Florida, having a big red wave in Florida. It's actually an interesting factor where it seems like the environment is no longer a national environment. A lot of these things, again, in a midterm, usually one party is wiping out the other party, like in every region of the country, in every race. But here, we've kind of got regionalized stuff. The Democrats did really well in several areas, especially, I think, in the Midwest, in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The Democrats did better than expected. But in Florida, in DeSantis country, Republicans seem like they cleaned up. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about, like, are we about to see a Republican civil war? Are we about to see like a DeSantis versus Trump extended nasty fight over, the direction the party needs to go in?
I mean, I wish I could say yes to that, but I don't think that we are. I do, again, want to just point back to a couple of things. Yeah, Florida had a good night. DeSantis had a good night. You had some Trump acolytes like, again, Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas have a really good night. But I think there was a rejection of the extremism overall. And I do think it's a bit of a cautionary tale for Democrats. It's less that Democrats, cleaned up because of something we did last night, and more that people were rejecting what Republicans are selling. And that's okay, again, in a midterm election where it's more of a political mood ring than it is a debate of policy ideas. But I do think that the cautionary tale here is that later in 2024, when we start entering this presidential election, Democrats do have to have a clear message. We do have to have big ideas, and I would argue new ideas, and policy to sell the American people on, because we're going to have to persuade them that it's not just about rejecting Trump and his brand or even Trump acolytes like DeSantis, but it's about embracing our ideas and why our ideas are creating a better future for people.
Yeah. I mean, I think 2024 goes very differently if it's a Trump election versus a not Trump election, right?
Absolutely. But even still, DeSantis is selling a lot of Trump's points. I'm curious to see, we don't have, again, it's early, we don't have some of this stuff yet, but I'm curious to see what happens on issues of education. Now our challenge is not just to message on inflation, but to actually work with the Fed to make sure that we can do something on inflation for the American people. I think we do have to have a better answer on issues of crime. Those are obviously concerns for Democrats. So there is a persuasion element, I think, entering 2024 that's just not necessarily one that had to happen here in the same type of way. And so it's a bit of a cautionary tale. And I think Florida also speaks to a couple of things that are happening in the Democratic Party. Again, we don't have everything yet, but I'm curious to see, the shift in the Hispanic vote. I'm curious to see what happened when you look at age demographics. We know that a number of young people came out in this election. Florida's a state where those demographics are skewed older. So again, I think that there are some elements here that we should be really excited about. Obviously, it was a great night for us, but there is a cautionary tale on some of the policy issues and what answers we're going to have for the American people running into 2024. And I will just say Trump outmessaged us in many ways early on in 16 and beyond. And I think that that simple messaging that you see his people pick up, like DeSantis, works. It works well.
Mm-hmm. I'm fully in agreement that voters are more skeptical of Trump the person than they are of Trump in terms of his policies. And he's personally becoming more and more toxic, I think. And you even see stuff like J.D. Vance, Republican from Ohio, who won the Senate seat there. J.D. Vance, somebody tracked this in his speech. He gave a long speech after, victory, and he thanked 35 different people and did not mention Donald Trump once. And I think there's kind of this shift where people are realizing Trump himself is unpopular, and there's this like Trumpism without Trump attempt that's going on. And so I'm very curious to see whether that Trumpism without Trump goes forward, or whether Donald Trump turns it into like a nasty fight over the next 2 years. Will he walk away peacefully? That doesn't seem like a very Trump thing to do, right?
And I love how you used J.D. Vance as the example there, because he's somebody who started out rejecting Trump, then embraced Trump, right, for his own political gain, and then neglected to mention him after he won. So,
yeah, he's a very cynical guy. Like, he is a Yale investment banker who's now cosplaying as like this nationalist from the farm guy. I don't know. I'm very cynical about Vance.
Totally.
So another story here, I think, and this ties into kind of my regional theme, because this is one of the things I'm taking away from this, is that this is very much a regional election in some ways. And maybe this ties into crime, like you were just mentioning, but where the Democrats did really well in, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and some other areas, one place they struggled is upstate New York. So I'm curious, as someone with experience in New York politics, do you have a theory about why this has happened in upstate New York? And, it seems like there's a couple big factors, but before I give my theory, you're probably more informed here than I am. So I'm curious what you're thinking about why Democrats are struggling there.
Sure. I think it's still early, honestly, some of those races in many senses to be able to have broad takeaways. But without a doubt, redistricting played in the night last night. And I would say not just in New York, but across the country. In New York, it was not the most positive story for Democrats, but across the country, it was a little bit better, honestly. There were places where obvious historical gerrymandering hurt us. I think, some of those pickups in Florida were very much because of favorable maps. But in New York, you had a couple of things. I think you could speak to potentially weak party involvement there, but I think more than anything, you could speak to the money that was spent. I mean, if you just took, say, New York 17 and the D-Trip chair, Sean Patrick Maloney's district, there was a lot of Republican money spent there. And I think that big influx, is not surprising. What a great story for them to be able to say, we took out the chair of the D-Trip.
I know, and it's crazy because depending on how things play out, Sean Patrick Maloney could end up saying, I had a very successful night in my role as a leader of the Democratic Party and trying to defend the House as best we could. But then he actually lost his own seat. Yeah,
and he did a lot for incumbent protection. He did a lot, really and truly, when you're looking at some of these red to blue pickups. So I think that there are different aspects at play in New York. Obviously, the map was at play, but I do think there was a good amount of Republican spending there because they were very hopeful about being able to flip some of those. That's going to be one of the takeaways. I would be reticent to speak, too much more without being able to see a little bit more information in terms of just what happened. Long Island is not surprising in any way if you look at 21 and kind of what happened last year. And then, just look at the state Senate out on Long Island. We did so much work in 2018 to bring so many people in, and now you've got 7-2 so in terms of state senators out there, so there's a lot of shifts there.
Look, I'm a city guy. If you want to insult Long Island, I'm here for it. So.
And I'm not trying to insult Long Island. I want to be clear. I just think, there was a lot there to watch who got knocked and why they got knocked. And this goes back to, I think, the questions and answers on tough issues like crime, and even more than crime nationally, immigration. Immigration is a big issue. It's up there. It was in all the polls, not to say that all the polls were particularly right before this election, but I do think that there are issues that undeniably the Democratic Party has to have good answers on, that people care about. And it's not just always the economy. Mm-hmm. There are other pieces at play, and that's sort of more to that point of like, really, presidentials are elections of ideas versus sort of moods. And we need to look at that and take it in a sober way and really work towards making sure we are making that argument for why the Democratic Party is better, not just for people's pocketbooks, but for their standard of living, for their lifestyle, for all the things that we know play into this. And I would even say education. Curious to see what happens with a lot of these school board races and where that's going. I'm sure you saw that was pretty prominent in DeSantis's remarks last night, and some of what he's taking credit for. So that's going to be a big playbook piece, I think, for 2024.
It's interesting you mentioned the polls, because there's been a lot of especially on the Democratic side, I think Democrats are basically like victims at this point who are ready to believe any terrible poll and disbelieve any good poll. We don't believe the polls, even if they show a Democrat winning. We kind of have Stockholm syndrome or something. I don't know. But the polls seem to have done okay this time around. It doesn't seem like there was this giant polling miss that everyone was afraid of, that, we're understating Republican support by 5 points. A lot of the big pollsters the New York Times guys and Nate Silver and some of these groups are all kind of taking a victory lap here, saying, yeah, what we thought would happen mostly happened. I don't know. It's just, I don't have any commentary here really, other than just, it's interesting that after freaking out about how badly we misaligned the polls in 2016 and in 2020, that maybe polls are back. I don't know.
Well, I think that there's a huge trend, Silver being the kind of leader of the trend to take aggregates, right? So they're really double, triple, quadruple checking themselves, their models where they sort of run it a billion different ways and splash it on a nice little infograph is definitely popular now. And you see more people doing that, more news sources as well. I do think that there is a little bit of a story on abortion in terms of whether or not that was really portrayed in the polls accurately and whether or not they captured so much of that energy. I think that there was fear that didn't, right? We were constantly seeing polls that were like, abortion doesn't even register. Abortion is like the third or the fourth issue for people. This is not going to swing voters.
I think there's an interesting story about Michigan, by the way, where I think that may have been true maybe in certain states, but in Michigan, I think abortion was the number one thing that people said in exit polls, like, what's your biggest issue? And obviously that matters because Michigan had a constitutional amendment or a ballot question about abortion and protecting rights there. And I wonder, did abortion really contribute to that big night in Michigan that we think Democrats had?
Oh, absolutely. I think Prop 3, which is what you're referring to, I think that was absolutely a big part of the night. I mean, and that's an interesting race, right? You had for governor, Tudor Dixon versus Gretchen Whitmer. Again, I'm a big Gretchen fan, have been for a long time. I think she's just a big star since her rise and her win in 2018. And I think the quality of her team and who she keeps around her really speaks to the kind of candidate and governor she is. But I think absolutely abortion played big in Michigan. And I think with the House and the Senate, you can look at that as well. There was, again, favorability in terms of redistricting, or at least a more favorable map. But there was also this big push. And I think people suddenly woke up to, if more things are kicked to states, what do we want to see? Going back to my sort of first comment about that piece, don't call them moderates, call them governors. When you're a governor of a state, there's a lot of things that you have to deliver on, right? You don't get to stand up every 4 years and say that you kicked the can down the road. You might not get those 4 years, right? You really have to make the case for why you should be reelected. You have to point to tangible things that you've done. You have to, make a more persuasive argument. And I think in addition to high approval ratings for a lot of these governors who have really not just run, but governed like moderates, you also saw them making a bit of a more persuasive case. And in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, right, abortion played big. I think if you looked at Evers' race, abortion played big.
Yeah, it's a shame that we're not going to get to unseat Ron Johnson, by the way, who is just an awful human being in every way. But I am glad we're holding the governor's seat. Potentially, it looks like that's happening in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And, it's just, I don't know. One thing that this actually gets into when I talk about Ron Johnson being an awful human being, it seems like there were a lot of really awful human beings, just objectively terrible people that were running as Republicans. And one of the big phrases that you heard tossed around, both before the election and as the results rolled in, was candidate quality. That the GOP is just nominating horrifying people, independent of their policy positions as a party, independent of what the Republican Party wants to do with America, that just they were nominating these kind of fools and clowns. Do you think that played a big role here? Or is that overstated? Is it really more about, just as you called it, the mood ring of the country?
No, I think candidate quality was huge. I think I said that in my pre-election review. I do also think that there were big things that the Democratic Party woke up to, right? If you just take, again, because I've done a lot of governor stuff, so I focus a little bit on the governors. But if you just take, say, the DGA, for example, they've got a great track record, first and foremost. Just want to give Noam and his entire team credit. But at the same time, they raised a ton of money this cycle. This was like one of the cycles where we were at parity in terms of what was raised. We got to watch, Republicans do like internally destructive things. For example, like the Purdue Kemp primary down in Georgia, they had to just waste money down there. RGA did. And so it really kind of helped us in many ways be able to be competitive in terms of just dollars spent in many of these races. And I think that is something that makes a difference. So I think you had, first off, candidate quality. You had the benefit of incumbency, particularly when it was a popular incumbent. You had most of these governors who were pickups in 2018 really governed like true moderates and tried to keep themselves there, even despite the Republican Party trying to paint people like Gretchen Whitmer or even Luann Grisham as extremists. They're not. And I think that all really helped create this sort of wall. And I think when you added the energy that something like abortion had on turnout for the Democratic Party, and then also places where you really saw it on the ballot, that really kind of created this beautiful combination where we were able to really hang on in a lot of places that looked tough. Again, I think the question now for Democrats is not to walk away from the night going like, wow, we absolutely, crushed it. We a little bit did, but I think it's a cautionary tale moving forward of people rejected extremism. They rejected extremism when it came to a woman's right to choose and just generally, not wanting local political leaders, as Mehmet Oz so beautifully put it in his debate, as part of that conversation. I think there was a little bit of like a ban, hands off my body aspect to this. Absolutely. But I think overall, when you're talking about just like what implications that has from the Republican Party of them saying that they should be able to, control these things that people find to be, personal liberty was really on the ballot. And I think also democracy was too. And I don't know how big it played, honestly, when we look through this, but I do think that there is something to be said about January 6th and people watching those hearings on their TVs, really unpacking what happened around Jan 6 and some of these election deniers. And I think that also had to motivate Americans. It was really a rejection of this extreme faction. That's not to say that some of them aren't in power. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's coming back to Congress. So
hopefully not Lauren Boebert, though. That was really unexpected, and it's still not finished. But there's a chance Boebert could be gone. Which
that's true. I think it's leaning towards her, but that's true.
We'll see. It's certainly much closer than anybody thought.
And that's important because for somebody like McCarthy, when you're talking about governing now, right, governing the House, say, I'll just be the optimist here and say we really do hold the Senate. He doesn't have wide majorities here, and that's a big deal for them. They didn't win these open seats when we were all hearing, oh, these open seats are trending more towards the Republicans than the Democrats. They really lost out there in many ways. You can look at that and see this razor thin margin. And so he is now going to have to do a lot to try to keep everybody in line, right? And not have just one or two people being rainmakers.
Yeah, and I don't think Kevin McCarthy has the political skill to like really control a GOP caucus if he has only like a 5 or 10 seat margin. And look, maybe nobody does. Maybe that's impossible because the GOP caucus is insane. But if they end up with a very small margin in the House, they're just not going to be able to get much of anything done.
I mean, we say that, but they tend to hold their people together better than we do in some ways.
Do you still think that's true? I feel like that's an old stereotype that's not, like, if you asked me Nancy Pelosi with a 4-seat margin in the House, I would say, Nancy Pelosi is a really skilled operator, and she's actually done an amazing job holding the caucus together, like, through this 2-year cycle. I don't think McCarthy can do that. I think the Republican Party these days is filled with, from the Tea Party forward, is filled with insurrectionists who want to overthrow the leadership, and, they all hate each other and are backstabbing each other. Like, you can look at how many, leadership changes they've had while Pelosi has kind of just still been steady. To me, it seems like they're the ones with the internal problems more than the Democrats.
I don't disagree with you there, and you're right to give credit where credit's due. I think Pelosi has done an incredible job keeping our caucus together because we have just as many outspoken folks. I do think we were also mollifying them with giving them many wins over the last 2 years in a lot of these large packages from ARP to IRA. There were some big wins in there. And I can appreciate the line of, oh, it doesn't go far enough, but I would still say there's some really big historic wins in there. I do think that the Republican Party still tends to air its laundry less in public than we do. We tend to try to have these public debates on nuance that don't translate well into messaging, whereas that party does seem to sort of eventually coalesce around something and then sort of stick to that message. To your point, is McCarthy the same type of operator as Nancy Pelosi? Absolutely not. Just nowhere near her skill, frankly.
All right, so I want to throw a couple stats at you and just get your reaction here, because there's a continual battle in politics. And I think this takes place with both parties, but I think especially in the Democratic Party, there's this battle of, do you win by activating the base, or do you win by persuading independent voters? And obviously there's the different theories of politics at play here. The left wing of the party tends to be more of a, let's activate the base wing. Moderates tend to be more, we need to play to independents. But what I'm seeing, 2 stats that I see here, David Shore posted this, that, it looks like turnout, he says, in Biden counties actually lagged turnout in Trump counties, and that the electorate in 2022 was actually 2% more Republican than it was in 2020, but that Democrats are winning anyway because of persuasion. The one other stat I will give you to react to here is that there's an exit poll on, how did you vote based on how you feel of Joe Biden? And people who strongly approve of Joe Biden went 96% for him, right? People who strongly disapprove of Joe Biden went 4% for Joe Biden. People who somewhat approve of Joe Biden, 91% voted. But, and this is the really, really interesting one, people who somewhat disapprove went 49% to Joe Biden, or I'm sorry, 49% to Democrats, I should say, versus 45% to Republicans. So even among somewhat disapprove voters, Democrats won those voters. So how do you think about this with the whole paradigm of, I guess, we have to persuade independents versus we have to activate the base?
Sure. And I think any good campaign does both. And you can do that structurally, the way that you set it up. But also, I'm going to just go back to what I have been saying, which is there is a difference, again, between midterm years and presidential years. And we shouldn't neglect that difference as we move forward. Those are interesting. Again, I'm a little bit hesitant to speak too early without being able to look at more data. But I do think that the economy, for as bad as inflation is, the economy itself is strong in many ways. And I do think that what you could potentially be seeing, and again, I have literally no data in front of me to back this up, but I think what we could be seeing is like the sense of people still have work, but their wages, they wish their wages were higher, right? To be able to keep up with inflation and some of the things that we're seeing. But it's not necessarily that they are unemployed or they feel completely left behind or down and out. And I do think that some of the big bills and the rescue measures that really happened under the current president helped that sort of sense and that feeling. Again, I just do think that Biden was elected on sort of the premise of let's get back to a reasonable place in America. Let's get back to a much more cooperative form of government that might involve compromise or will involve compromise, but definitely is one in which the parties are talking to one another. And I think when you look at bills like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, that's a way in which Democrats could turn and Biden himself could turn and pivot and say, like, look, we worked across the aisle here. And I think that there are some of things like that. How much did that resonate with voters? I don't know. I saw plenty of polls that said that voters knew nothing about IJA or they knew nothing about IRA.
Yeah, I mean, the average voter, yeah, I agree.
Right, exactly. But I do think that they can feel it in the economy.
Well, and I'm gonna take your idea and like just twist it a little bit because I think I agree you're on the right track, but I would actually twist it and say it's more a lack of feeling than it is a feeling. It's like negative polarization, and Biden actually does pretty well there because the last 3 presidents we've had have all attracted intense hatred from the other side. Liberals despised George Bush, and we can talk about the very good reasons they might have done that, but he attracted a lot of ire, especially by the end of his term. Conservatives obviously they really hated Obama. He attracted all sorts of anger and vitriol. And obviously a lot, Democrats really hate Trump. And I think that's a big motivating factor when you talk about this idea of the mood ring, which, by the way, I'm stealing that phrasing. That's going to be mine now. But when I think about Joe Biden, they make fun of him sometimes. Oh, Joe Biden is senile, but like nobody really gets so frothing with rage, kind of like angry about Joe Biden. He's hard to get angry about, I think. And I think that impacts the whole idea of like, this is just a mood test.
Sure. And I don't want to take credit for the mood ring comment because that's a Will Marshallism. So credit where credit's due for our fearless leader here at PPI. Yeah, I don't disagree with that comment. Again, I think what we need is a little bit more data here to try to make big predictions about ways in which this went. I do think also there is a sympathy for Joe Biden from working people. He's very much painted himself his entire career long as, somebody who came from a working class background, is a working class kind of guy, cares about working people, cares about those types of basics. And I think that is also something here potentially that's a piece of that polling that you were citing, or those statistics, excuse me.
All right, so we've got a little bit of time left. I want to do a little bit of forward-looking stuff because we're not entirely done with this election. One of the big things that's going to be coming up is it looks highly likely that there's going to be a runoff in Georgia, and that could potentially be for the 50th seat in the Senate. It could be for the 51st, and maybe it doesn't matter, but it could end up being a replay of 2020 where it all comes down to Georgia in a runoff election. My question here is, Raphael Warnock versus Herschel Walker. Do you have any sense of who it helps to be in the runoff? Do you have any sense of who benefits in kind of the second round here?
Good question. Well, we've already seen Warnock do a runoff. I would say he benefits in a couple of ways in terms of just, like Kelly, honestly, out in Arizona. He's been on the TV for a long time now. He's basically been running for 2 cycles. I think also a positive sign is that you saw a lot of people split their ticket, right? There were a lot of ballots when you look at those numbers, and you look at Kemp's numbers versus Abrams' numbers. There were a lot of people who came out who voted for Kemp, the Republican, as governor, but then voted for Raphael Warnock. I think I take that as a positive sign to have that many split tickets there in the state of Georgia. So I'm not sure that you could give either of them a true advantage, but I would say potentially structurally Warnock has more of an advantage, and he definitely has the precedent for being able to win something like that.
Yeah, I think about I wonder if Kemp not being on the ballot this time is it advantageous for Warnock. That Kemp is probably more popular than either of them. Kemp's going to win by a bigger margin than either of them did. And I wonder if, Walker is a little bit hurt because of that. I also wonder if just, if Republicans are dispirited because it seems like, oh, well, we've lost, or even if we won the House, like everybody knows we didn't do as well as we were expected to do. We feel like crap. The party's infighting. I wonder if that's a factor. But then also I wonder, am I just creating reasons to be optimistic? Am I like, pumping myself up for all the reasons Democrats are going to win? And that's an instinct I feel like you have to guard against sometimes.
Totally. And I think our national brand didn't help Stacey Abrams in that race. Kemp had benefits of incumbency, etc. He had also the benefit of having had a tough primary, so his name was really out there for Georgia voters. They saw a lot of him running into the general as well. So like a lot of airtime there. But I also think that one of the things you sort of saw was you saw Warnock sort of stay away in many ways from the Democrats' national brand, and you saw Abrams just really get tied to it in a way that I don't think helped her when you're talking about the statewide. So I think one of the challenges here for Warnock is to be able to continue to define himself the way he has done and win Georgia voters that way without letting the Republican Party tie him too much to the Democratic apparatus or the machine or the extremism of AOC or something like that, right?
Well, and hopefully we're going to find like a fifth secret love child for Herschel Walker. The fifth one's the charm. So
I don't think if you didn't care about the first one, that you're not going to care about any of the subsequent ones, is my personal read on that. I do think that there is, turnout is a big thing for that election for sure. There was a poll that came out today recently actually, that the national youth vote choice for U.S. House was 63% for Democrats and 35 Republicans. That's not the Senate, but that is, the younger age voters going more than half of them supporting Democrats versus Republicans. I think the question is just like, for some of those turnout stats in some of those places, are we going to be able to turn out that group and demographic who are historically unreliable voters when it comes to turnout again in that runoff?
All right. Well, we are coming up on time, so I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we ask every guest on this podcast, and that is, where can people go if they want to learn more? You are somebody who's obviously been in politics for a while now. You have a lot of experience. And I'm curious, for people who want to follow electoral strategy and messaging strategy, are there any particular resources you would recommend? This could be books that you think are valuable to read, a person with a good blog, a person just who you should follow on Twitter, and an article, anything that you think would be helpful for people who want to understand the messaging battles, the strategic battles, and these kind of election night fights that we've been talking about.
So I'm big on locals. I really do believe the political ism, all politics is local. I think my two recommendations would be, I think everybody should read the Kramer book, What It Takes, right? Was canned when it came out and then became kind of a big piece of the political canon, political literature canon. But I think the biggest thing I would recommend you do is to get involved locally, and more than anything, go talk to people who have lived through a lot of election cycles. Go talk to people who, you might not love if there's a Republican machine or a Democratic machine in your county or your area, or maybe it just doesn't exist. There are still those people who have turned up every election, have worked to organize people in their community, have stood up for their values, have been local community leaders, or again, organizers. Gosh, they have some amazing battle stories. They've seen some crazy stuff. America's a crazy, crazy, crazy place. And there's just so much I've learned really and truly from those people when it comes to elections. It's something that if you're ever organizing, you know who those humans are. If you don't know them, you get to know them really, really quickly, because those are sort of the people who can direct you in a new place or a new turf or area, as we would call it, as to what to do and what not to do. And a wise woman in New York politics once told me, it's not who you know, it's what you know about who you know. And I think that's also the case with races. It's not just about what you know about the district. It's what you know about what happens to that district or what has happened to that district in past and in present. So I'd really encourage young people, one, to get involved, because truly there is no tomorrow like today. And then also, I think, go find those people in your community and sit down with coffee or lemonade or whatever you like to drink and just listen to their stories and try to hear from them, what they would have done differently or how they see it now. I think that's just a different perspective. It's also a perspective that helps those of us who are young also understand that huge voting block that is voters over 55. And it's really important that we do have some cross-generational pollination in our politics because those are people who reliably come out to vote. So yeah, I would get to know a lot of those local leaders, people who might not have been the elected official, but maybe they were the chief of staff, or maybe they were the campaign manager, or maybe they were just the number one volunteer for literally every local council race in your area for the last 20 years, right? There's amazing people out there who make politics work, and they're often not interviewed. They're often, not talked to unless people know to talk to them. And I think that they're really a critical component to making sure that communities do end up with the representation that they want to have.
Well, since we're talking about local organizers, I will finish the podcast by thanking all of the new liberals, neoliberals out there who worked during this election. I know that we were in a lot of races where it ended up being close races, and fortunately, Democrats won. The New York City New Liberals were out for Pat Ryan, who has won. Sean Casten in Chicago, we had our Chicago chapter out there. Abigail Spanberger, we're very happy to see her survive in Virginia. We had the DC New Liberals out there. We think Kim Schreier in Washington, we think she's going to be okay. It's not been called yet, but the Seattle New Liberals were out for Kim Schreier. So thank you to all of our local organizers and everybody who's out there, actually fighting the good fight. And we will see what happens with the rest of this. We'll see what happens in Georgia. And as of right now, it looks pretty good for Democrats, but the betting markets have them as the favorites to maintain the Senate at this point. But we'll have to see. My guest has been Sarah Paden, political veteran and vice president, national political director at PPI. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremiah. It was a pleasure.